Okay, well, good evening, everybody. It's a very great pleasure to welcome you to another one of our regular Zoom sessions of the Anglo-Turkish Association. You will recall, of course, that we've been having these Zoom sessions for some time, and we are thinking that perhaps before too long, we'll be able to go back face to face again, but the answer is not quite yet. But for those of you who don't know me, my name is David Shanklin, and I'm the chairman of the association. And this evening, we have the very, very great good fortune to welcome my predecessor as chairman, Sir Kieran Prendergast, who is one of the most distinguished diplomats, if not the most distinguished diplomat of his generation, who's held senior roles, to my knowledge, in 3 continents, perhaps in more than that. You can ask him when he gives his presentation. But a very, very distinguished ambassador to Turkey, one of the most senior roles in the United Nations, as well as a profound, long, and indeed very senior commitment to Africa. And perhaps also he will be happy to talk about those other experiences as well when we come to questions. So it really is wonderful that he's here to speak with us this evening. And the best thing we can do, I think, is to turn the floor over to our speaker. So Kieran, please.
Thank you very much, David. I'm certainly far from the most distinguished diplomat of my generation, but I am not averse to being so described, even if unjustifiably. These are just some rather shallow and random reflections on encounters with Turkey and Turks over the past 50+ years. I went to Turkey as a language student in October 1964. The Foreign Office in those days would ask you whether you wanted to do a hard language or not, and Turkish counted as a hard language. So I said yes, and on the form I wrote that I would like to do either Amharic or Japanese. And as you know, Amharic is the principal language of Ethiopia, and Japanese happens to be the principal language of Japan. So a little while later, I got a call over from the personnel department to say, I'm frightfully sorry, Prendergast, but I'm afraid we can't do Amharic, as we only have 1 Amharic student every 5 years. And the quota for Japanese is full. But we found you something in between, namely Turkish, which I suppose was geographically true, but not in any other sense. So I got ready to go to Turkey, and one of the first people I asked to see was Andrew Mango, who was at the time, I think, head of the Turkish service of the BBC World Service. And I thought he was actually pretty discouraging. Himself a master of about 8 or 9 different languages. When I said to him, look, I'm going there for 10 months, full-time language training, do you think at the end of it, I will be able to say, a coherent word in a complex sentence in Turkish? And Andrew said in his inimitable way, oh, I shouldn't think so. So that was not the most encouraging start. But what was much more encouraging was, and I don't know how, but Zeki Kunaralp was the Turkish ambassador to the United Kingdom at the time. And he invited me to the embassy to come and have a cup of tea. I was completely a nobody, and he was a very distinguished ambassador. I think he'd already been Secretary General Mustashar of the Foreign Ministry. And I went and had about an hour's tea with him, and he told me all sorts of fascinating things, particularly about what life was like as a young Turkish diplomat. And he'd had to learn one hard lesson, because in those days, when you wrote a telegram, it was done in book cipher, which is a very complicated way of turning plain language into cipher. And his ambassador happened to be very long-winded. And so he and his colleagues rather got into the habit of praising the ambassador's distinguished words, reducing them by about 50% in length without losing any of the meaning, and then sending them off to Ankara. This went well until the ambassador went on leave. And the ambassador, being rather proud of his own prose style, went into the ministry and asked to have a look at some of his telegrams, and was enraged to find that these were not the telegrams that he had drafted, but rather the much, much shorter versions that young Kunaralp had decided to send. Anyway, there was a lesson there for that, but thank God in the Foreign Service by then we didn't have book cipher. We had machine cipher. In those days, you didn't fly to Istanbul if you were in the Foreign Service. In fact, you didn't fly anywhere without special permission because it was regarded as an exotic and rather expensive form of transport. So I went by train to Genoa. I was rather sad because there was a ship service once a week, and alternatively it went from Genoa and it went from Venice. And as you know, Venice is a much more interesting city than Genoa, but my week it was Genoa. So I wandered around Genoa for a day, then got on the ship for 5 days. And in those days, the waiters were all, the ship staff were all Italian. And then when we took, a good few years later, we went to Tel Aviv by ship, we'd found that they had become Greek. And then when another few years later, we went back to Turkey, when I went back to Turkey as ambassador and took a ship to Izmir, we found that the waiters had all become waitresses and they were all Thai. So just one of those things that happened over 30 years with different standards of and rates of development. One of my most vivid memories still is of arriving in Istanbul by sea across the Sea of Marmara and seeing out of the haze the minarets of the skyline of Istanbul, and thinking what a magical experience that was. And then being very much dismayed when we docked and seeing the Hamals wandering around with huge things on their backs and talking in a language which was so indistinguishable to me that I was sure that I'd never be able to learn it. But I did. And I learned it mainly from a wonderful woman called Güzin Berkmen, who was a divorcee of about 50, who lived at 9-2 Topçular Caddesi. And my modus operandi was 6 days a week to have a 2-hour lesson from her. And of course, being a lazy fellow, the first half an hour anyway was taken up with breakfast, which was cooked by her 70-something-year-old mother, who for some reason took a great shine to me and treated me as a sort of son or grandson. I learned Turkish very largely by attempting to translate the lead articles, the Baş Makaleler, by Abdi İpekçi from Milliyet. And Abdi İpekçi was a wonderful person, but for a language student, he presented some difficulties because each sentence was about a paragraph long. And there were a few tricks in those days to learning to translate a very complex Turkish sentence. And the first, which was not without its difficulties, was to find the subject. There was a clue because in Turkish in those days, after the subject, Abdi İpekçi always put a comma. So if you wanted to cheat, you just went straight through and found the first comma, and then you could assume that that was the subject, and then you work backwards from that. And then, of course, the verb and the object. But he did write very, very long sentences, and he did use quite complicated language with a lot of subordinate clauses. The locally engaged information consul in the consulate was called John Hyde, and he was a Levantine. He knew everybody. He spoke perfect Turkish, of course, because he'd been born and brought up in Turkey, and he took me a bit under his wing. And so he took me to meet Abdi İpekçi, and I can't remember whether I asked him, maybe he could write slightly shorter sentences, but if I did, it had zero effect. Güzin was a wonderful woman to work with because she kept her lessons interesting, not just through Abdi İpekçi, but also she would produce works in a simpler Turkish by medieval poets, or in the modern era by Orhan Veli. So I remember not just Sere Serpe, which was reproduced at a poetry evening in the Anglo-Turkish Society several years ago, but also sort of odd lines like Gümüşi biriktim, coştum, piştim, Sol elim, zavallı elim, and so on. These are just sort of little fragments that stick in my memory. But she also taught me a poem by a medieval wandering Abdal called Agyahi Baba. And I think I can still remember that. Ben şu fani dünyada bir kamilinci görmedim. Geçti ömrümte ölüncek bir sefasın sürmedim. Kimine zevki sefa verdin, kimine derdi mihnet. Ey felek, ben sen gibi kalleş düzenci görmedim. I don't know how many of you understand that, but it's quite, in that strange world, I never saw a perfect pearl. My life passed until death without pleasure. To some you give joy, to some you give misery. Hey, fate, I never saw a treacherous orderer of things like you. So he's a complaint to God, really. And I say for some reason that has stuck with me. I can't say I worked hard. I can say that I had quite a vigorous social life. I went to a lot of nightclubs. I drank a lot of rakı. I lived for the first 4 or 5 months in a family. And I remember one evening when I'd come back rather sloshed, and there was a bottle of water in the door of the fridge. So I glugged down about a good slug of it before finding that it was rakı, not water, which did not help. And on the way home, I very often used to go. There were a whole a string of işkembeci restaurants on the way back to where I lived, or where I would get a dolmuş to where I lived, and I used to sober up with a bowl of işkembe çorbası, of tripe soup, which I must say I always enjoyed, and I still have a taste for tripe, although my darling wife Joan, who's sitting there, can't stand it. During the course of these evenings out in nightclubs, I met a wonderful singer called Ruhi Su. He had been in prison for what was described as communism. I don't know whether by today's standards it would be communism. And he had been a bass opera singer, and he got sacked from that. So he was making a living as a singer of türküler, these folk things, and he played the saz. And I got him to come to parties of mine where he would perform, and we became quite close. And he used to call me Kerimhan. And the other figure I particularly remember from Istanbul was Zeki Müren. I never met Zeki. Is his name familiar to all of you? He was the most wonderful. He had the most wonderful voice. He was flamboyantly gay, but he was, despite whatever prejudices there were in those days, very widely beloved of the Turkish public. And I saw him in a rather comic performance of Tea and Sympathy, where he played, by this time he must have been in his 40s, but he played a teenage boy at a school who had doubts about his heterosexuality, and then fell for the headmaster's wife. And Zeki played this with great élan, but I can't say very convincingly. I also used to hear him because at that time, over the wall of the consulate, over the wall of the garden of the consulate, there was a nightclub. And in the summer, Zeki Müren obviously had a stint there. And I can still remember maybe his most famous song in those days, Mavi gözlü sarışın kız, gel gidelim adaya biz. So blonde, blue-eyed girl, let's go to the island together. Anyway, that was something that I remembered. There was also the other well-known person whom I met on one occasion was İsmet İnönü. He was already pretty old, and he was very deaf, but he came to a piano recital at the Consulate General, and the Consul General used to rope me in occasionally to help with things as a sort of usher, I suppose. So I ushered Mr. İnönü to the front row, and a problem arose during one of the very soft periods of the piano recital, because Ismet Bey was by then extremely deaf and had a large hearing aid, and he obviously turned it up very loud because it started to resonate with the crystal chandeliers in the ballroom. So there was this sort of rather nasty ringing noise from the chandeliers, and nobody quite knew what to say. And I think someone whispered in the pianist's ear that never mind playing things softly, she'd better play it a lot more loudly. I had a lot of Turkish friends. We all went together to Alanya for the Bayram. In those days, you didn't have the infrastructure that you have now. So there was a metal road as far as Afyon Karahisar, and we spent the night there. And the more active members among us got up before dawn to walk up to the top of the Hisar. And from Afyon down to Alanya, it was dirt road. And we arrived in the late afternoon. And there was a girl called in our group called I still remember because of the wonderful name she had, Lale Akkoyunlular. You know that the Turkish legend is that there were 4 tribes that entered Anatolia, and one of them were the Akkoyunlular, the people of the white fat-tailed sheep. She was a bit precious, and she decided to go for a swim. So she went onto the beach and she opened the door of the little cubicle changing rooms and shrieked and almost fainted because it was Kurban Bayramı, and somebody had slaughtered a ram, and it was hung up there with its entrails out, so which was a bit much for Lale's delicate sensibilities. I also went to on a tour to the Black Sea coast, which was wonderful, and particularly stayed a few days in Giresun. We went up Kulakkaya mountain, where one of my friends decided he wanted to drive the embassy Land Rover and strip the gearbox. So we had to stay for another 3 days while they got another gearbox sent from Ankara. And the shame was so much for the collective town of Giresun that the head of the hazelnut cooperative insisted on providing his car and driver full time. And I still remember the name of the driver. It was Keser Hamdi, Hatchet Hamdi, who was, as his name implies, a rather solid and beefy chap. Anyway, I went to Ankara the following summer in July. Ankara was not what it is now. It was a city of about, I don't know, was it 1 million or 2 million? Anyway, nothing like what it is now. And I had an apartment which on one side was on the edge of Anatolia, but on the other looked out over the city. And if in winter, if there was no wind, there was a pea souper because they were burning lignite. It was before the advent of natural gas. If there was a wind, then it blew it out, but Ankara is in a bowl. So if there was no wind, you had this thick pea souper. And if you wanted to go into town, you drove down into the pea souper. We could also at night see across to the mountains on the far side, and there was almost nothing there. When I went back, of course, there were a huge number of gecekondu's, which had been built in that sort of area. I don't remember that much work-wise about the time I spent in Ankara the first time round. I do remember being in Parliament when I thought it was Ecevit, but when I look it up on Wikipedia, it seems to have been İnönü who said "Ortanın sonundayız," we are on the left of centre, which was a kind of revolutionary remark at the time in 1965, but now seems pretty modest. The ambassador was called Sir Dennis Allen. He was a rather shy New Zealander. He didn't speak Turkish, but he was a very experienced and senior diplomat, and went back after Ankara to be a deputy under secretary in the Foreign Office. Funnily enough, the only other thing I remember very sharply was the declaration of UDI in Rhodesia in I think it was November 1965, where we all got these flash telegrams, where flash telegram being one you have to act on immediately, instructing us to go and inform the foreign ministry that this had happened and that Britain expected everybody to oppose it and was seeking sanctions. Again, I had a pretty good social life. My secretary was called Semra Ulagai. She was a very, very nice and well-connected girl. So she introduced me to Galip Balkar, who happened to be the private secretary to the president at the time. And another friend was called Ergun Pelit, whom Semra later married. Galip Balkar tragically was murdered by Asala, the Armenian group, a good few years later. But when I knew him, he and Semra and Ergun taught me line dancing. So we used to play. I had an advantage over more people in that I had more Western records like Woolly Bully and a couple of Rolling Stones records, which were very good for line dancing. But most of my social life was done at a nightclub called Sureya. I don't suppose it exists anymore. And Ergun was the most wonderful dancer and very good company. And apparently, if things were dull in Sureya, they would ring him up at home and tell him to come in, and he would have a free meal and a free drinks and a free evening there because he got things going. I also knew officials, and one I particularly remember is Akshit Kayalar, who was at the state planning, Devlet Planlama, and he was also he didn't dance, but he was a very good friend. I did quite a lot of shooting there, but got into trouble occasionally for shooting the wrong thing. I mean, things that weren't meant to be shot. But if it was there in front of you and it was a bird, one tended just to pull the trigger. I did it even worse when later on when I was living in Zimbabwe, when I shot a cormorant rather than a duck. If you don't do shooting, it probably doesn't mean anything to you. And of course, it was in Ankara that I met my darling wife, Joan, to whom I will be married for 54 years next month. Anyway, I left Ankara. I went back to the Foreign Office. I spent a couple of years 2.5 years in the NATO department, and then I went to Cyprus, where I was particularly responsible as the Turkish speaker for the Turkish Cypriot community. I knew Rauf Denktaş quite well. And of course, I met him later on when I was at the UN. I met him first at the High Commissioner's lunch about a month after I got there, and he asked me, "How long have you been here?" And I said, "About a month." He said, "Well, you understand the Cyprus problem better than anybody else in the island, because you're new, you're fresh, you see the forest, and from now on you'll start seeing the individual trees, and you will see it with less perspective than you see it now." And he was probably right. The vice president was called Fazil Küçük, and he owned the main newspaper, which is called Halkın Sesi, the voice of the people. And I had a tailor, which was next to the Halkın Sesi offices. And I was always rather taken aback, because when I went for a fitting, if it was late afternoon, the vice president of the Republic was usually sitting on a chair, but sitting backwards on the chair, with these arms over the back of the chair, and chatting to anyone who happened to pass. So in many ways, he was quite a sort of modest fellow. But I did drop a clanger, because at one point we gave quite a large party. In between 64 and 74, social mixing between Turkish Cypriots and Greek Cypriots was pretty easy. And you never met them on one side or the other, but they would come to your house, and you could have mixed dinner parties, mixed drinks parties. Anyway, I was giving quite a big drinks party for both communities, and I got a phone call from the undersecretary to the vice president saying, "I gather that you're giving a party tomorrow night." And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I just wanted to let you know that unfortunately, none of us will be able to attend." And I said, "Oh dear, why?" He said, "Well, the vice president is very offended that he hasn't been invited." And I said, "But look, I'm a second secretary. I'm not the High Commissioner. I'm not even the Deputy High Commissioner. I'm a second secretary. I'm a junior person in the High Commission." He said, "Well, nevertheless, if you want any Turkish Cypriots to come, I suggest that you issue an invitation today to Dr. Kachuk, which of course I did. He didn't come, but he wasn't offended anymore, so everybody else was able to come. In those days, the Lidra Palace was still open, and it was particularly famous for prawn curry on a Sunday. It was right on the Green Line, and that's where we used to give the Queen's birthday party, which was the only national day other than the Greek national day that that President Makarios used to come to. And I remember particularly the first one, because Denktash came, and he was chatting to Glafkos Clerides, who was his opposite number in the intercommunal talks that were taking place then. And Glafkos said to Denktash, you know what I really regret? I haven't had a kebab at Charlian's for years. So Denktash said, well, let's go together and have one now. And they did. And of course, Clerides' security detail were mortified and horrified, because there was the leader of the Greek Cypriot communal chamber pushing off into the Turkish sector, where there were lots of Turkish troops and mujahid there and so on, with no protection. Anyway, he turned up again after a couple of hours. He's obviously had a very good time. We had a weekend house near Kyrenia in a place called Tatlısu. It belonged to Osman Örek, who was the constitutional minister of defense. We called it, perhaps tastelessly, the erection, and we loved it there because it was right on the coast with nothing except a bit of rock between us and the sea. And across the other side of a tiny bay, there were a bunch of houses which belonged to Kemal Rüstem, who was a bookseller who had a house which was bang on the he had a shop which was bang on the front line, and we used to mix a lot with the mostly rented to the American embassy. Anyway, there was a gap then. I did spend time on the Cyprus issue when I was a junior, when I was the first secretary in the British mission to the UN in New York, which is, I think, the first time we met David, who was out for David Lane, who was out for one of the general assemblies. And I became very friendly with Faruk Loğlu, who was my opposite number in the Turkish mission, and a very rational chap. I don't know if he rings bells to you, but he afterwards became the head of the foreign ministry and ambassador to Washington. And of course, for a Turkish diplomat, member of parliament for CHP, the party of the diplomats. So we went back to Turkey, this time as ambassador in 1995. I was struck by the obvious physical changes in Istanbul and Ankara. In Istanbul, one used to be able to look across the Bosphorus at the green and wooded hills, and they were now all covered with houses. I don't think there was a bridge the first time I was there. There were two bridges. Ankara had grown enormously, particularly the growth of gecekondu's. We had a very, very nice residence with quite a large number of bedrooms on the ground floor for the staff. Most of the staff joined the local staff, the household staff, joined the residence at the age of about 15. And what they had done, all of them, was establish a gecekondu when they got married. And they'd all benefited from offers from developers to exchange their gecekondu for one apartment or even two apartments, or in the case of our head gardener, Jamil, I think 4 apartments, because he got such a large plot in his gecekondu. So they'd all done very well out of the enlargement of Ankara. We noticed that dress code had changed a lot. Something which I find rather ugly, the tessiture was being very widely worn. I was never sure whether it's a matter of religious observance or religious fashion, and basically a bit of social coercion. But we noticed that in the countryside, things were pretty well what they were in the 1960s, where women would wear sort of loose trousers, shalvat, and a loose headscarf, but otherwise they were not sort of bundled up in this conceal all tessiture, and very often the scarf would be quite colourful and the trousers would be quite colourful. And of course, we also noticed the way in which infrastructure had developed, traffic jams had developed, but motorways all over the place, Turkish Airways flying all over the place. For the ambassador, I noticed a number of things, some of them good, some of them less good. No Rolls Royce anymore. Dennis Allen had a Rolls Royce. I don't know when that stopped. Do we still have a Rolls Royce when you were there, David? But anyway, I had a Rover 800, which had to have a special German engine because it was armoured and it couldn't get up Jinnah Caddesi, too steep, with a British engine. So there we are. BMW by then owned Rover. There was even more distressingly no steam yacht. In my first time in Istanbul, the ambassador had a steam yacht with a full White Russian crew. And in fact, I went on it. During my time in Istanbul, the ambassador was far too busy dealing with the Cyprus problem. So the consul general had free use of it, and he took me out on a very nice trip to some of the uninhabited islands in the Sea of Marmara. Anyway, that had gone. When I looked up the records as to how this disaster had occurred, I found that the Treasury had agreed that in perpetuity, the ambassador should be entitled, and his wife should be entitled to a 2 weeks blue cruise every year. But that seemed to have somehow gone the way of all flesh also. So no yacht, no blue cruise, not much privacy. People seem to regard, in the embassy, the residence as a sort of public space. So we did a few changes. First of all, we put up a sort of wall to demarcate the embassy from the residence from the rest of the embassy. We put a fence around the bit that we regarded as ours, because otherwise there were people traipsing all over the place and you just had no privacy at all. We also had 2 bull terriers, and they were inclined, the male particularly was inclined to eat tortoises, which I thought was a bit unfortunate. So it served the other purpose of protecting the tortoises. But there were also very good things. I think ambassadors are extremely well looked after in Turkey. If you go to the airport, any airport, you use the VIP lounge. You get on the plane in a different bus from everybody else. You sit at the front of the plane. Your luggage comes off before anybody else. You don't have to wait for your luggage at all. And you get well looked after by the MFA. I found the MFA a bit reticent. I think the influence of the undersecretary who was Honor Omen, was to be a bit suspicious of foreigners. I found that you had to wait, and you had to sort of demonstrate that you were worth talking to, that you were a trustworthy person, and so on. It took quite a long time. But the biggest shock for me was that I'd been High Commissioner in Zimbabwe, I'd been High Commissioner in Kenya, and in both of those places, the British ambassador, or rather the British High Commissioner, is the #1 diplomat by far. And I found the British ambassador in Turkey was not the #1 diplomat, not the #2 diplomat either, and I don't think not the #3 diplomat. The #1 diplomat was the American ambassador. The #2 diplomat was probably the the German ambassador, because of the very large number of people of Turkish ethnicity or Kurdish ethnicity who lived in Germany. Maybe the Russian was #3, maybe the French was #3, but I think we toddled in at about #5 or 6 or something like that. And we were more, I found, observers of events than participants in events. And I wasn't used to that. So it's an immensely interesting country, and I decided to do as much travel as possible. I also, we had, there were some difficulties with the government of the day. Mrs. Chiller was erratic, in my opinion. She didn't manage her time very well. I mean, I took David Simon, who at the time was chairman of BP, which was about the biggest company, British company, which at the time was also looking at oil pipelines, which might go through Turkey or might not. He was on the advisory board of Deutsche Bank. He was a big wheel. She kept us waiting for 3 hours. And then we were told then she had 20 minutes, and she said, "Tell me what can I do for you?" So I rang up Wyman the next day and said, "This is outrageous. This is supposed to be a first world country, not banana republic. I'm used to that in Africa, but we expect more from Turkey." And also the question was not what can she do for us? It's what can what can BP do for you? He said, "It's your fault." I said, "Why is it my fault?" He said, "You didn't ask me to arrange the call." So I said, "Well, I'm sorry again, but this is a first world country. We went through all the proper hoops. So it doesn't sound very good if to get an appointment done properly, you've got to ring up the head of the foreign ministry and ask him to do it personally." Anyway, Demirel, on the other hand, President Demirel was really excellent. And in fact, some of that 3 hours, Demirel heard that we were being held up and invited us to come and pay him a call, which we did. And we had time to get back from that call and still be kept waiting by Mrs. Childer. I can't say that Cyprus featured very much. Iraq was a big issue, particularly the no-fly zone, and quite a lot of domestic opposition to the big Anglo-American French presence down on that airfield. Funnily enough, a disproportionate amount of time was spent dealing with Roj TV, which was a Kurdish TV station, satellite TV station, which happened to be based in London. And when I went at the beginning to see the permanent undersecretary, he said, "Your mission will be a success or a failure, depending on whether you close down Roj TV." And I said, "Well, sadly, that's not something in my gift. And, we have quite strict rules about what's allowed and what isn't allowed. And unless they do something which is not allowed, there's not much we can do about it." And then when I went to see the General Karadayı, who was the chief of the general staff at the time, he said he couldn't understand how a dost ve müttefik ülke, such as United Kingdom, wasn't expelling Roj TV on the spot. Anyway, it was a grumbling appendix. We tried to get the Home Office to be a bit more rigorous about looking and seeing whether inflammatory material was there, but it was still bubbling when I left. I suppose the other issue, which maybe we might talk about later, would be Turkey's aspirations to join the European Union and irritation at being always somehow kept in at the back of the queue in the waiting room. So whoever joined, there was a foreign minister at the time who said, "How can it be that Bulgaria, the dairyman of the empire, is put in the queue ahead of Turkey?" I mean, you'd had an application since 1972, I think. I think the great mistake made by Ecevit was not to ask for full membership at the same time as Greece asked for full membership, because if you had, I don't think either would have got in at that time. Then I went to the UN, where Cyprus was more of a subject. I thought that this was bound to end in disappointment and tears, because the EU made a fundamental mistake when they offered Cyprus the prospect of full membership without making any condition of Cyprus settlement. So where was the incentive on the Greek Cypriots to compromise? We did manage in 2004 actually to negotiate a settlement, and this was a weird process. I don't know how much interest there is in it, and we can go into it more if you like. But we had ever since the early days, the UN had never been allowed to make proposals. they could make suggestions, they could bring forward ideas. But under the time pressure of Cypriot impending full membership, we did manage to squeeze both sides into agreeing that there should be an arbitration done by the UN, subject only to a binding referendum in both communities. And we did split the difference. We only got to do that because when we put it to the wily Tassos Papadopoulos, he said yes, being sure that the equally wily Rauf Denktash would say no. And then we didn't tell Rauf that Tassos had said yes. We just put the same question to Rauf Denktash, and the wily Rauf Denktash, being sure that the wily Tassos Papadopoulos would say no, said yes. So we ended with both of them being absolutely astonished to find that the other had not blocked this proposal for binding mediation and then arbitration. But and Kofi asked me to go every 2 weeks from New York to Cyprus to see how it was going. And I told him on the phone the morning after I arrived the first time that it was bound to fail. And it was bound to fail because on arrival, I was offered a cup of coffee, what I would call Turkish coffee, and what the lady called Greek coffee, by a Greek Cypriot lady who asked me to explain whether she was going to get her money, her villa back in the north of Cyprus. And if she wasn't, what exactly was she going to get by way of compensation and when? And of course, the arrangements were amazingly complicated. So that was the first thing. And then I asked the driver on the way up to Nicosia, and there was no, there was no incentive. It was very, very complicated. Rauf Denktash had rather cleverly greatly eased access to the north. So Greek Cypriots could go to the north. The Turkish Cypriot dentists were cheaper, tailors were cheaper, having your car repaired was cheaper, and above all, you had casinos in the north when casinos were banned in the Greek Cypriot areas of Cyprus, and it turned out that lots of Greek Cypriots liked casinos, so they were able to go and so what was it? It was like living in sin and being invited to take on all the burdens of marriage when you've been told by your own side that those burdens will be immense and without benefits. Plus, a lot of Greek Cypriots had gone back to their villas and been hugely disappointed because they had these mystic memories of villas from 30 years before, 40 years before. And they thought they were wonderful, huge villas, whereas there'd been a lot of economic development in the south, and they came and found they were rather humble. They also thought, what school are my children going to go to in a village where most of the inhabitants are Turkish speaking? So it was pretty clear to me that the thing would go down in the Greek Cypriot referendum. And it did not help that Tassos Papadopoulos decided to lobby very publicly against the settlement of which he was part. So Turkish Cypriots voted, I think, 55-45% or 56-44% in favor of the referendum. They're smart. They wanted to be members of the European Union. They wanted to have visa-free travel to the United Kingdom as members of the European Union. And the Greek Cypriots voted about something like 75%, 25% against. What was really very disappointing was that when we did a report to the Security Council, which laid the blame where it belonged and laid out a fairly open account of what had happened, and also argued that it would be a mistake to punish the Turkish Cypriots for basically having said yes in the referendum, this was never discussed in the Security Council. It was blocked by the Germans, the French, and funnily enough, the Russians as well. Nobody wanted to discuss it. Just going back a tiny bit, one thing I had meant to mention was that I realized on my second time around in Turkey how little I actually knew about Turkey, Turkish society. For example, I don't think the first time I was there, I was really very conscious of the existence of Alevis. We were saying earlier that I'd read a book later by David Shanklin about life and research he did in an Alevi village over a long period. I didn't realize basically they were there. I realized quite a lot when I was there the second time, particularly in Mehanes, because I don't know, there's a greeting where you rub when you're drinking with these chaps, and you rub the back of the hand and you say, Jan Jana, Kan Kana, heart to heart, blood to blood. And I don't think I was aware first time round of the strong element of class in Turkey. I'd kind of assumed that it was a meritocratic, classless society, but I became aware of the phenomenon of white Turks, black Turks, even in the foreign ministry. They all came from a particular background. I think most of them were the descendants of Ottoman families who had been servants of the Porte. Most of them, very few of them really had origins in Anatolia. Most of them had origins in Greece or the Balkans. They were Albanians, they were Bosnians, they were Greeks, but very few of them could say that their families really came from somewhere like Kayseri. And a lot of them had a rather dismissive attitude towards people from the mainland of or the main areas of Anatolia. Let them get on with their business and so on. And we are the guardian culture, and we will make sure that that the values of the Republic are maintained. I think that's about as much as I want to say by way of introduction. I'm sorry about the rather random nature of it, but I'm sure we can open up things in discussion. And I see that David has obviously got a pint in his hand and enjoying the evening sunshine in Yorkshire. It's piddling down with rain here in Herefordshire. David.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That was absolutely fascinating. But really, yeah, what a wonderful, colourful and interesting career you've had. Really, that does sound remarkable. I was wondering whether the aftermath of the Menderes affair was anything that impinged upon your time in Turkey at all.
Well, in a very direct way. I used to take dolmushes everywhere, and quite often when I had a very late night, I would go to Taksim Square and find a dolmush and offer to pay him 2,5 lira for the 5 seats in the dolmush. And sometimes you even had to work quite hard to persuade the chap to take the 2.5 lira rather than waiting for another 4 people, and to tell him that it was in his economic interest to take me to Shishli. And by the way, in Shishli was the first Turkish high-quality takeaway that I ever came across. I think Liman had a little branch in Shishli where you got all these delicious dishes, hot and cold to take away. And the reason why I mentioned Menderes because there was a very opulent motor car, which I was told was Mr. Menderes's personal vehicle, which had become a dolmush in its declining years. But 1960, one didn't hear much about that. One didn't hear much about Menderes. You had occasional little kind of hints, like, for example, that Demirel's party's favorite whiskey was White Horse, Demir Kirat, because of course the use of the term Democrat was Spanish, but Demir Kirat was the nearest thing to White Horse whiskey. No, it was sort of almost covered up, really. Turkesh wasn't there. I think he'd been banished to be a military attaché in some embassy abroad. He did used to come to my Queen's birthday party when I went back as ambassador, with quite a large party, and always a very diligent attender, because he was born in Cyprus. So he felt a sort of almost sort of post-colonial attachment to the former colonial power. And it was quite interesting because I had 1 or 2 colleagues, particularly the French ambassador, who was very sort of moralistic, and he would not invite Turkesh. I think he wouldn't invite Ecevit either, because of the problems with left-wing and right-wing death squads the 70s, which had led to a couple of military interventions. But no, it was almost, yes, you know, we all knew what had happened, but it wasn't something that was discussed.
That's absolutely fine. The other thing I was going to say, Ruhi Su, of course, became, as the years went on, he became a figure of enormously important significance in the Turkish cultural scene. Really enormous. I mean, they adore Ruhi Su, and they play his music incessantly even today. It's quite remarkably successful.
Well, we got on very well, and in fact, when I went back, I invited Güzin Hanım to our apartment in Pera House, the Consulate General. She didn't please me very much at first because she sat down, she brought one of her daughters, and she said, "Kieran, when did you get so fat and so bald?" Because when she knew me in the 60s, I had a full head of hair and I was a sort of slim young man. I ought to say also, part of my social life, I had a huge crush on her married daughter, who was very beautiful. She was called Nil Gereder. She was married to Dr. Selçuk Gereder, whose brother was a hero of the Turkish army because he was doing his military service in Korea, and someone threw a grenade into their trench, and he threw himself on top of it and was killed protecting his comrades. And the Gereders used to give wonderful parties quite late at night, well, all-nighters really, starting at 10 o'clock. And Selçuk made his own vodka. I mean, he took the ordinary, the state monopoly vodka, and added. Is somebody not muted?
That's me.
Oh, it's you, is it? Someone? These are locals. Locals interrupting you. So he'd add lemons and stuff like that to make a more flavoursome thing. When I was leaving Istanbul, his father had been Turkish ambassador to Japan in the years immediately before World War II, and Neil gave me at the time. Brocade waistcoats were quite fashionable, and I was moaning on about the fact that I didn't have a brocade waistcoat, and she gave me a piece of brocade which had been given to her father-in-law as a present by the Japanese Foreign Ministry when he left Japan. So it's probably extremely valuable, and I'm afraid I had it cut up into a waistcoat. Unfortunately, I'm far too corpulent now to wear it, but it's still upstairs. It's still up. You said it's still upstairs. Mm-hmm. Jane said it's still upstairs, and it's rather beautiful, but I'm afraid no longer a single piece of brocade. Anyway.
Well, colleagues, please free to ask your questions, but just while you're thinking of yours, could I ask about something I've always wondered about, which is Turkey's role in the United Nations? How effective do you feel Turkey is in that environment?
I don't think they didn't make a big impact when I was there, and there was some reluctance to have them on the Security Council or Greece on the Security Council either, because there was a worry that they would grind their axe too much rather than be impartial members of the Security Council. Not that stopped various others from doing so. They had some pretty good ambassadors. When I was in Ankara, I was I got on very, very well with Inal Batu, who became ambassador to the United Nations. I also should mention that the other person I really had wonderful arguments with, very civilized and decent arguments with, was Gündüz Aktan, who didn't get on with the undersecretary, but was a wonderful person to deal with because he always dealt with your arguments. And I appeared for the Anglo-Turkish Society in Ankara with him to debate about whether Turkey had a destiny as a member of the European Union. And he appeared with a big pile of books to prove his thesis, which was that Turkey had always been and would always be the other against which the Europeans define themselves and that therefore it was impossible for Turkey ever to be a member of the European Union. And I said that, well, I argued probably in a less sophisticated way that this was nonsense. We did have, I should say that we did talk about that issue a fair amount during my time in Ankara. And what I used to say to my diplomatic colleagues was that, Jenny, that's making a lot of noise. Sorry. Yeah, because it's crackling. I said that Turks don't mind how long they have to wait, but what they need to know is the direction of travel. That if they meet the required criteria, you know, the Copenhagen criteria, any other criteria, economic criteria, developmental criteria, that they will then have an open path to membership. And some of my colleagues in the European Union meetings would say, oh, we can't have that. That's a terrible idea because the Turks might meet those criteria. And essentially, I think the Germans and the French, even then, were of the view that the Turks were not Europeans. Why were they not Europeans? Because after all, if you did a DNA test on most Turks, particularly in the, so let's say the western half of the country, you'd find there was a very high percentage of overlap with Greeks. But it's to do with religion, isn't it? And even though Western Europe has increasing numbers of Muslims in their society, nevertheless, there's this feeling that that these are Christian countries and that therefore Turkey does not qualify. I think it's nonsense, and I thought that a major objective of Western policy, and certainly of British policy, should be to bind Turkey into Western institutions so that they don't go floating off in the direction of Central Asia or wherever. And when you look at Turkish history, Ottoman history, the migration was always east to west. It was never west to east. A bit of it was east to south, the Mughals in India. But other than that, I mean, the Ottomans' golden apple was Rome. It wasn't Tashkent or anywhere else like or Alma-Ata. And it's no coincidence that the Ottomans reached the gates of Vienna twice. So, and I think one of the more worrying tendencies in today's Turkey is the sort of clash between Atlanticists looking west and the Eurasians who are looking east and attempted to join things like the Shanghai grouping. I think a lot of that is due to persistent rebuffs by the European Union, which I think is extremely unwise of them. And I'm not saying that because Britain's not in the European Union anymore. I was saying that when we were in the European Union. I think it's a failure of strategic thinking.
Yes, thank you very much. Don't let me monopolise, please. Please don't be shy, people, to ask questions. I know that people will have lots of questions. It's just a question of jumping in. I don't know, Chidem or Peter or Simon, would you like to ask something? Please, Chidem.
Wait, don't run to it.
You're still muted, of course, Chidem.
I'm all right now. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. You brought back so many memories. But everything that you said, I mean, I'm reading Jeremy's book on Menderes. And I used to know his wife, for example. And things like she would always bring with her a handbag. And that bag would be placed outside Demirel's door entrance, and people would put money in there because they were so short of money at one point after he was hanged. I mean, all sorts of things like this, but you brought back so many names, so many memories. I wanted to say, oh yes, I know that person as well, but I don't want to because it just sounds so corny. But yes, it was exactly like that. Thank you so much. I don't have any questions. No.
Thank you. I think that one thing I like about Turkey, people have, they do pay their debts, so to speak. So, and I wanted to pay my debt to Zeki Kunerel. And when I went back as ambassador, I found that he was living by himself. He had muscular sclerosis, a very slow developing form, but he was in a wheelchair when he had a housekeeper, but other than that, and he was living in rather a nice flat, I think in Floria, overlooking the water. And when I went down to Istanbul, I used regularly to go and have a glass of tea with him. And he was always, I mean, his body was frail, but his mind was still razor sharp. And he was also extremely candid about things. I mean, well, actually, some of them I better not say. But I very much enjoyed going to see him. And another name I want to mention is Charlie Angel. I was saying to David and Craig yesterday that one of the things I slightly regretted when I went back was the erosion of social distinctions. So in the 60s, if you saw a policeman, there was nothing wrong with calling him police effendi. And my Kapager, I didn't have much awareness of Kurds the first time round, but most of the dustmen and a lot of the Kapagers in Istanbul were Kurds, and mine was called Zihni Effendi. And I remember particularly going with Dennis Allen on a call on the foreign minister, and I liked it very much that when he opened the doors to the minister's room, he said, "Ihsan Sabri Bey, here is the British ambassador." So you had this, Bey was for Beys, but it was the first name. And when I went back, I found that everybody was a Bey, and I refused to do it in my own house. But what I did was always address them as Siz for respect, not Sen. But I wouldn't call my sort of chief steward Durmush Bey. I just call him Durmush. But if he'd been in the old days, he would have been Durmush Effendi, I think. And that would have been, I would have called him Durmush Effendi. So this kind of erosion of useful social distinctions is a bit of something I regret. And I do remember Charlie Angel as being a very stylish sort of grandee of Turkish diplomacy. Thank you.
He was very funny, and he really was what you would call a card, actually. Okay. Yeah, he was very, very funny.
I also, I was telling David yesterday that later on, after I left the UN, I went back to Istanbul, and I had a meeting with Özdem Sandberg, and he had invited Ilter Türkmen,
Yes.
and they were talking about various things, including how awful it was that so many Turks these days went to Imam Hatip schools and sort of madrasa type things. And David Barchard, with whom I'd become very friendly, he and I both went to Catholic boarding schools. So I said, well, I think you should know that David and I were both educated at madrasas. And David was quite annoyed. He said that. So I said, well, they were both run by monks. So and Catholicism was an integral part of the agenda. We went to mass at least once a day, twice on Sundays, evening prayers, morning prayers, all the rest of it. What's the difference between that and a madrasa? Maybe the curriculum was a bit broader. We didn't learn just the Bible, but nevertheless, anyway, there we are.
You would be terrified. I'm very much involved in education in Turkey for years now.
Yeah.
You would.
Yeah, well, I've got a friend who used to be a minister in the AKP government who tells me it's failed. Leading members of AKP don't want to send their children to Imam Hatip schools. Anyway, so let's not get into too much modern politics.
Yeah. We stop there.
Please, any more questions? I don't know whether David Lane is still here. I've got a feeling his connection has gone. But if there's anyone else who would like to ask a question, then please just jump in. I'll wait for a second to give people a chance.
Okay, Kieran, I'll speak. First of all, let me just say what a fabulous talk. I really, really enjoyed it. It was wonderful. I only wish my wife had her been here, she's had to go and take my Turkish mum-in-law, who's here at the moment, for her second vaccination. So she's missed it, but hopefully she'll be able to see it on the website, because she was at Mulkiye Ankara University doing international relations at a similar time, and I met her shortly afterwards. First went to Turkey in '88, and one of the first things so interesting to hear, because every time you go back to Turkey now, it's changed. The pace of change is moving very fast. Some of it good, some of it not so good, but that really struck a chord with me, because every time you come back, you look around, there's a whole, I mean, we have a house in the Izmir province, down on the coast near Çeşme, in a small town called Alaçatı, which I first saw as a tiny little donkey village and has now become almost like a tourist attraction. It's absolutely heaving in the summer before the pandemic, with all the glitterati from Ankara, Istanbul and Izmir. It's a very arty place, and just a bit too crowded. Now, my mum-in-law's house is maybe the quietest place to be. Forgive me, Kieran, but I may have missed this, but have you written a book on all your experiences?
No, I don't think it'd be of any interest to anybody. In the same way, I was often asked why I didn't write anything about my life in diplomacy, and because I was private secretary to 2 foreign ministers, and I said I feel very strongly that if you establish a relationship of confidence with somebody, that should stay a relationship of confidence, and particularly if you're a private secretary to a minister. I don't like it when ministers write these very indiscreet memoirs, but a minister has to be able to trust the people who are closest to him as officials, or her as officials, to keep their confidential. Otherwise, why would they be honest and direct with you? They should be able to be very rude about other people or very rude about you or whatever, and it stays within, I call it in the confessional, being a Catholic. So, you know, it's a lifetime obligation, and the rest of it is just it's ephemeral, isn't it? Really, you know, there were no great events when I lived in Cyprus. There was the attempt on Makarios's life. That was quite exciting. The murder of Georgagius. I went to Georgagius's funeral, and I realised that that he might have been quite close to the British in a certain way. But there were no big intercommunal bust-ups when I was there. At the UN, it wasn't, the big bust-ups were about things like Iraq, Afghanistan, and so on. But they've been written about by you know, by academics, and one's involvement with them is sort of is transitory. Anyway, at least this will be presumably be on the website in due course.
So you're a gentleman and a diplomat, and I understand entirely where you're coming from, but I tend to disagree with it not being of interest to people. But absolutely wonderful. One further thing, if I may. I'm not getting too much into politics, but obviously you touched on it. The current direction of Turkey is heading east and not west. You also said a very interesting thing about some of the AKP diplomats not sending their children to the Islamic schools as well, which I wasn't too sure of. My wife would probably know all about it. What's your take on how you think this will play out? Do you think that Erdogan will win another term and Turkey will continue marching east and not west? Or do you think that it may liberate a little and come back to the centre and still maintain relations with the West?
I don't know. I think we'd agreed before we weren't going to get into that sort of stuff, only because I don't want to make difficulties for the Anglo-Turkish society. But I do believe that the long-term orientation of Turkey has always been westward. But you know, you can't keep rebuffing them. You can't keep rebuffing a country without it looking for alternatives. But you know, most of the interests, I think, lie westward rather than eastward. I mean, I know long ago when I was there as ambassador, there was quite a lot of disappointment when the Soviet Union broke down, that it was not possible to have the sort of relationship that they had hoped to have with the Turkic republics. There'd been great hopes that because that Turkey wasn't alone anymore, that you had these 4 Turkic republics. But I remember meeting a senior Turkish intelligence official a few years ago, and he'd been to a meeting of the top intelligence officials of the former Soviet Union, and he said, and of course the discussion was entirely in Russian. Those Russian decades mattered quite a lot. When Turkic Republic ambassadors used to call on me in Ankara, they and I would speak in Turkish, and the first secretary they brought as an interpreter from Kazakhcha or whatever into English wasn't needed, but he had no idea what we were talking about, because he'd been brought up as a young Kazakh or Uzbek or whatever official with Russian as his first language, because otherwise you couldn't get on. So that was a disappointment. But I always describe Turkey as having a rather unique position, because it's it's a bit east of west, it's well west of east, it's north of south, but it's also a bit south of north. So it's just that bridge in a very unique position. They'll have to find their own destiny. But when I think of Turkey, foreign languages, what are the foreign languages? Are they Russian or Chinese? No, they're English, German, maybe a bit of French. But the orientation, what's the most popular drink other than alcohol in Iran? Probably Coca-Cola, isn't it? What do people want to wear? They want to wear jeans. They don't want to wear kulak hats or whatever. So I think the orientation will remain fundamentally Western, but you've got to remember the degree of frustration and disillusion when you are repeatedly rebuffed. It's part of this business I spoke about earlier, about the disaster of the deal that was done with Cyprus, because most of the chapters of the EU accession negotiations with Turkey are blocked, and they're blocked by Greece and they're blocked by Cyprus. So that's a difficult thing to overcome. During my time in the UN, there was a fundamental change in Greek-Turkish relations, because you got a prime minister, Simitis, and then you had George Papandreou, and whereas I think a lot of their predecessors had used Turkish issues as a sort of football domestically, they decided to take a very responsible issue. And then I don't know whether you remember, I think when I was, no, it was after I left, earthquake diplomacy, where there was a big earthquake in, I can't remember whether it was the first one was in Athens and then in Istanbul, but firemen went from one side to the other to help out, and created an enormous amount of goodwill. And maybe if you'd had a different president of Cyprus than Tassos Papadopoulos, you might have got a different outcome to the 2004 negotiation. Sorry, I meandered around a bit.
No, not at all. So Kieran, I'm not going to stop your discussion, but my iPad's about to die an early death from lack of nourishment. But so I'll hand you. I'm afraid I'm going to have to hand you over to the good hands of Craig whilst you're carrying on discussion. I'm terribly sorry, but it's been a great pleasure to see you.
And you. Thank you very much. Enjoy your beer.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to ask anything? I think shocked into silence.
Can
Craig,
I ask you something?
Yeah, of course you can.
Hi, it's Suna. It's just regarding this, Cyprus issue. Do you believe that the Turkish side, and both, I mean, the Turkish Cyprus and Turkey, did enough? Just because you mentioned that the Security Council, it was discussed, this issue was discussed after the referendum when the Turkish Cypriot accepted it. Do you believe that the Turkish side did enough about this issue, because it was extremely unfair.
Well, I'm not sure what more they could have done. They had a very skillful lead negotiator in the shape of Uğur Zial, who was the undersecretary. He's very, very skillful. I think they negotiated almost a bit too well, actually, because I was with Kofi Annan in Switzerland for the very last tweaks that were done to the map, and we had given the Carpath Peninsula to the Greek Cypriots because it's pretty useless, actually. There's no water, and it's a long finger of land. It's only got one village because there's no water, and there's a monastery at the top end of it. And Zial made the strongest representations to me that we shouldn't do this. Because you see, the army thought that this was a dagger pointing at the throat of Turkey, which honestly isn't really true, because it's 30 miles away from Turkey. There's no air base, there's no military base, there's no naval base, there's no harbour, and it's about 2.5 minutes fast flying time from the nearest Turkish Air Force base. But Kofi decided to give them that, and it just tilted it just a little bit. In terms of percentages, away from, made it look that little bit less favourable to the Greek Cypriots. So he negotiated brilliantly, but maybe he negotiated too brilliantly in terms of the subsequent referendum. Anyway, there's not much the Turks could do. I mean, more than anything, we were extremely annoyed because we'd done a very balanced report. I've never come across a report by the Secretary General to the Security Council which got no discussion at all in the Security Council, which was shelved. And as I say, what was really shocking was that it wasn't just people like the Germans and the French who blocked the discussion. It was also the Russians, because you know the Russians have a lot of interests in the Greek Cypriot side of things. They've got a lot of money in Greek Cypriot banks and so on. So they all lined up basically to suppress our report. It's still on the record somewhere, but it still hasn't been discussed in the Security Council. So what can Turkey do? They can't insist. We tried to insist, and but it's up to the council to manage its own agenda, and whether it discusses things or whether it doesn't. Unfortunately.
Yep. Thank you. I totally enjoyed your talk. I was born in Ankara, especially when you were talking about Ankara, and I feel the same after living in this country for 30 years. Every time when I go to the city where I was born, I felt so bad. So thank you. I enjoyed your talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Well, one of the things was, I think I told you that my apartment in 1965 was right on the edge of Anatolia. There was nothing behind it but hills. But when I went back, there was nothing behind it but more apartment buildings and more roads and more suburbs and so on, going over the hill and into Anatolia.
Yeah, but the apartment that, the flat, I mean, when you we could see all the gecekondos, but it was green, and now it's all gone, and with all those apartments and all the greens, they were gone as well. So to be honest with you, I prefer the old days when there were gecekondos.
I think they've removed. I think they've knocked a lot of the gecekondos down because they're going to do new development there, but they've people have been offered alternative housing, probably in accommodation which would be more modern but less satisfactory, because the gecekondos are one story, whereas if you're on the fifth story or seventh story or 10th story, it's probably for a family with children not really so good. More modern but not so good.
Yeah, thank you.
Is there anybody else? Because otherwise I think we're probably filled our time.